A Viet Cong political officer stood before 37 fighters in a cave complex deep inside the Ma Tao Mountains. It was November 1968, and the air underground was thick with moisture and the sharp mineral smell of limestone. The men crouched on their haunches, faces drawn with fatigue, some still bandaged from wounds that had barely closed. The political officer held a single sheet of paper, handwritten in ink that had smudged at the edges from the humidity. On it were instructions that no other Allied force in Vietnam had ever provoked. He read the words slowly, and each sentence landed in the silence, like a stone dropped into still water. Do not engage the Australians unless absolutely necessary. Do not attempt ambush, because they are more likely to detect the ambush before entering it. Do not attempt pursuit, because their counterattacking capability makes such efforts futile and potentially fatal. If contact is unavoidable, break it off immediately and withdraw. These were not the words of a defeated army. The Viet Cong in Phuoc Toi province had fought the French for a decade. They had fought the South Vietnamese with contempt. They had fought the Americans with confidence, studied their patterns, exploited their weaknesses, and built a doctrine of aggressive ambush that had filled body bags from the Mekong Delta to the Central Highlands. But the Australians were something else. The Australians were something the Viet Cong had never encountered in 20 years of continuous jungle warfare. And to understand why a battle-hardened commander would stand before his own men and tell them to run, you have to understand what the Viet Cong had been watching, because they had been watching. For 2 years, they had been studying, analyzing, and documenting every observable detail of Australian operations in their province. And everything they learned terrified them. The story begins not with the Australians, but with the enemy they replaced. Before the first Australian task force arrived in Phuoc Toi province in April 1966, the region had been a Viet Cong stronghold for over a decade. 2 main force regiments, the 274th and the 275th, operated from base areas in the Hat Ditch Secret Zone to the northwest and the Ma Tao Mountains to the northeast. Between them, the D445 Provincial Mobile Battalion served as the local force, intimately connected to the population, drawing recruits from the villages of Dat Do, Long Dien, and Hoa Long. Together, these forces numbered roughly 2,500 fighters. They controlled the roads. They taxed the villagers. They moved through the province as though it belonged to them, because for all practical purposes it did. The Americans had been there first. The 173rd Airborne Brigade had conducted operations in and around Phuoc Toi before the Australians took over. The Viet Cong studied the paratroopers with methodical patience. They learned that American units moved in large formations, company and battalion, strength, creating noise signatures that could be detected from hundreds of meters away. They learned that American soldiers carried a chemical scent profile unlike anything the jungle produced, a cocktail of soap, deodorant, insect repellent, and sweet Virginia cigarette tobacco that lingered in the humid air like a neon sign. They learned that American patrols followed predictable rhythms, that helicopter insertions announced arrival points from kilometers away, that artillery support followed patterns that could be anticipated and exploited. Against the Americans, the Viet Cong had built a formidable playbook. Prepare the ambush site in advance. Position fighters along converging axes. Open fire in the first 30 seconds with maximum violence. Withdraw through prepared routes before the artillery becomes effective. Reposition and prepare for the next engagement. It worked. It worked extraordinarily well. The Americans had firepower that could reshape the landscape, but they could not find what they could not see, and the Viet Cong had made invisibility into a science. Then the Australians arrived, and everything the Viet Cong understood about fighting Western soldiers stopped making sense. The first Australian units to establish themselves at Nui Dat in June 1966 were conventional infantry battalions, the 5th and 6th Battalions of the Royal Australian Regiment. But even these regular infantry operated differently from anything the Viet Cong had encountered in their long war against Western forces. The Australians patrolled in smaller units, typically platoon strength or less. They moved more slowly, more deliberately, pausing constantly to listen, to observe, to read the jungle the way a hunter reads a landscape. They did not crash through the undergrowth. They did not talk. They did not follow roads or obvious trails. Australian journalist Neil Davis, who spent a decade covering the war, noted that Australian patrols sometimes took as long as 9 hours to sweep a single mile of terrain, moving forward a few steps at a time, stopping, listening, then proceeding again. This was not caution born of fear. It was methodology born of experience. The Australians had also chosen their base location with a strategic intelligence that distinguished their entire approach. Nui Dat sat on a central position in Phuoc Tui, astride a major Viet Cong transit and resupply route, close enough to the provincial capital of Baria to provide security, while far enough from the population centers to maintain operational secrecy. Unlike American installations, which often sat adjacent to populated areas and therefore leaked information through Vietnamese civilians who worked on base, the Australians cleared a 4,000-meter security zone around Nui Dat and permitted no indigenous Vietnamese inside the perimeter. The Viet Cong's extensive human intelligence networks, which could determine troop strengths and operational plans at most American bases within hours, were blind to what happened inside the Australian wire. They used counter-ambush drills and contact procedures that had been refined during the Malayan emergency of the 1950s, where Australian and New Zealand forces had spent 12 years fighting communist insurgents in terrain remarkably similar to Vietnam. Those contact drills taught soldiers to react automatically in battle, providing a split-second advantage over an enemy that relied on centralized command decisions during engagements. The Malayan experience had fundamentally shaped how the Australian military thought about jungle warfare. It had taught them that the jungle was not an obstacle to be overcome with firepower, but an environment to be mastered through patience and fieldcraft. It had taught them that small patrols, well-trained and well-led, could dominate terrain that battalion-sized sweeps would simply push the enemy through. It had taught them that the key to counterinsurgency was not killing the enemy in large numbers, but separating the guerrilla from the population that sustained him. But the conventional Australian infantry, as effective as it was, paled in comparison to the unit that would fundamentally alter the Viet Cong's understanding of what was possible in jungle warfare. The Special Air Service Regiment, the SAS, arrived with 3 squadron in June 1966. They numbered fewer than 100 men. Over the course of the war, the 3 Sabre squadrons would rotate through Vietnam on year-long deployments with never more than about 150 SAS troopers in the country at any given time. To the Americans, who had 500,000 men in Vietnam and still could not control the countryside, the notion that 150 soldiers could make any meaningful difference seemed absurd. The Viet Cong did not think it was absurd. The Viet Cong were paying very close attention. The first contacts between the SAS and enemy forces in Phuoc Tuy province established a pattern that would persist for 5 years and drive Viet Cong commanders to progressively more desperate assessments of their situation. The SAS patrols operated in groups of 4 to 6 men, inserted by helicopter into landing zones carefully chosen to minimize the chance of detection. The helicopters of 9 Squadron, Royal Australian Air Force, developed their own specialized techniques for these insertions, flying at treetop height with a precision that amazed American aviators who observed their operations. The insertion aircraft would make multiple false landings, touching down briefly at several locations before depositing the patrol at the actual insertion point, ensuring that any Viet Cong observer tracking helicopter movements could not determine which touchdown had been the real one. From the moment the patrol members' boots hit the ground and the helicopter lifted away, these men entered a mode of existence that bore almost no resemblance to conventional military operations. Within seconds of insertion, the jungle swallowed them. They vanished into the green as completely as if they had never existed. They moved at speeds that would have struck American commanders as operationally worthless. Where American long-range reconnaissance patrols covered 2 to 3 kilometers per day, Australian SAS patrols sometimes covered less than 500 meters in the same period. They moved a few steps at a time, froze, listened, observed, and then moved again. The discipline required to maintain this pace for days on end, without conversation, without rest breaks, as conventionally understood, without any of the small comforts and routines that soldiers use to manage the psychological pressure of operating in hostile territory, was extraordinary. It demanded a particular kind of psychological fitness that went far beyond physical endurance. The Viet Cong began to notice the effects of this movement discipline before they understood its cause. Sentry reports from the first months of Australian SAS operations told a consistent and disturbing story. Patrols were being hit from positions that sentries had not detected. Trails that had been used safely for years suddenly became killing grounds. Supply parties moved along routes that intelligence confirmed were clear and walked directly into ambushes that seemed to materialize from empty jungle. The confusion intensified when Viet Cong tracking teams attempted to locate and pursue SAS patrols after contact. Tracking was one of the primary skills the Viet Cong had developed over decades of jungle warfare. They could follow French colonial forces, South Vietnamese Army units, and American patrols with relative ease. American jungle boots left distinctive tread patterns. American movement left broken vegetation, compressed soil, disturbed leaf litter, all the signatures that an experienced tracker could read as clearly as printed text. The Australian SAS left almost nothing. They stepped on roots and rocks rather than soft earth. They avoided disturbing vegetation when possible. When crossing muddy areas, the last man in the patrol would brush out tracks using branches. They wore footwear designed to leave minimal impressions. The tracking teams would find the site of an ambush, examine the ground where the Australians had waited, and find so little evidence of human presence that some trackers began to report that the attacks must have come from positions the enemy had occupied for only seconds, not the hours or days that were actually the case. The D445 Battalion's operational logs from this period, captured after the war, revealed the creeping comprehension that something profoundly different was happening in Phuoc Tuy. In the months after the SAS began operating, The logs contain increasingly frequent references to unexplained losses, fighters dispatched on routine missions who never returned, courier teams that vanished between known waypoints, sentry positions found unmanned with no indication of what had happened to their occupants. The D445 political officers initially attributed these losses to desertion, which was a persistent problem for Viet Cong units throughout the war. But the pattern did not fit desertion. Deserters left trails. Deserters could be tracked, and often were. These men simply ceased to exist, as though the jungle itself had consumed them. The truth was far more unsettling than desertion. The Australian SAS had developed ambush techniques that were devastating in their simplicity and merciless in their execution. A typical SAS ambush involved a patrol of 5 or 6 men positioning themselves along a trail or known enemy route, then waiting in absolute concealment for however long it took for targets to appear. Hours, sometimes days. When the Australians were in their ambush positions, they did not fidget, did not shift weight, did not scratch insect bites, did not swat mosquitoes. They achieved a quality of stillness that went beyond discipline into something approaching a different state of consciousness, a predatory awareness in which the body became part of the landscape while the mind remained ferociously alert. The ambush itself was initiated with claymore mines and followed by concentrated automatic fire from multiple positions. The SAS employed a technique of firing at an extremely high rate during the initial seconds of contact, deliberately creating a volume of fire designed to make the enemy believe they had been engaged by a much larger force. This psychological deception bought critical seconds during which the enemy reacted to a phantom platoon or company rather than the handful of men who had actually sprung the trap. The entire engagement lasted seconds. The SAS patrol would then conduct a rapid assessment, collect any intelligence material from the enemy dead, and withdraw before any Viet Cong reaction force could arrive. The kills were clean. The withdrawals were silent. And the psychological effect on the surviving Viet Cong was cumulative and devastating. What made the SAS ambushes particularly effective was not just their lethality, but their unpredictability. American ambushes, when they succeeded, tended to follow patterns that Viet Cong commanders could study and anticipate. They occurred at certain types of terrain features at certain times of day, following certain operational patterns. The SAS ambushes followed no discernible pattern. They struck on trails that had been used safely for months. They struck at times when local intelligence suggested the area was clear. They struck in locations where the terrain offered no obvious ambush advantage. The Viet Cong could not develop counter-tactics because they could not identify the variables that governed where and when the SAS would strike. By late 1967, a year and a half into Australian operations, the Viet Cong command structure in Phuoc Tuy was grappling with a tactical problem they had never faced before. They could not find the Australians. The D445 Battalion had once been the D445 Battalion. The D445 Battalion had once been the dominant military force in the province, able to mass hundreds of fighters for operations against the South Vietnamese. Now, its commanders were losing sleep over 5-man patrols they could neither locate nor avoid. By 1970, the SAS had been operating in the province long enough that the Viet Cong had finally begun to learn some of their insertion techniques. Helicopter patterns became partially predictable, and enemy forces occasionally fired on landing zones moments after SAS patrols touched down. The Australians adapted immediately, developing what they called cowboy insertions. A helicopter carrying the patrol would be followed by a second helicopter with a decoy patrol. Both teams would insert, move together briefly, then split, with the decoy team returning to the landing zone for extraction while the real patrol continued its mission. If the enemy was waiting at the landing zone, the decoy team drew the response, while the operational patrol vanished into the jungle untouched. Even when the Viet Cong thought they had cracked the code, the Australians changed the code. The intelligence apparatus of the Viet Cong was sophisticated and deeply embedded. They had agents in the South Vietnamese government, in the military, in the villages surrounding Nui Dat. Village elders who appeared loyal to Saigon by day passed information to Viet Cong couriers by night. Fishermen on the coast tracked naval movements. Workers in the towns counted trucks and estimated supply levels. These networks provided detailed information about conventional Australian operations, battalion movements, cordon and search operations, road convoys. Intelligence flowed from the villages to the district committees, to the provincial headquarters, to the regional command, a system refined over 2 decades of continuous warfare against successive enemies. But the SAS operated almost entirely outside the observation capability of these networks. The patrols were too small, too silent, and too unpredictable to be tracked by human intelligence. The Viet Cong's greatest intelligence advantage, their intimate knowledge of the local population and terrain, was neutralized by an enemy that did not interact with the population and left no trace on the terrain. This is when the watching became systematic. The Viet Cong command in Phuoc Tuy, unable to counter the SAS through conventional tactical responses, began dedicating specific resources to studying Australian operations. They debriefed every fighter who survived an encounter with Australian forces. They analyzed the timing, location, and method of every known SAS ambush. They examined the sites of engagements with forensic attention, measuring distances, mapping positions, trying to reconstruct the geometry of attacks that had lasted fewer seconds than it took to describe them. What they learned was documented in a series of tactical assessments that would eventually circulate through the Viet Cong command structure, from provincial level to regional military headquarters. These documents, many of which were captured by Allied forces during the war and others recovered after it ended, constitute one of the most remarkable tributes any guerrilla force has ever paid to a conventional enemy. The assessments acknowledged that Australian SAS patrols were effectively undetectable through any means available to Viet Cong forces. They could not be smelled because the Australians had eliminated the chemical signatures that made American patrols detectable from hundreds of meters away. They could not be heard because their movement discipline produced no sound distinguishable from the natural ambient noise of the jungle. They could not be tracked visually because their counter-tracking techniques were superior to anything the Viet Cong's own trackers, men who had spent their lives in these jungles, could overcome. Their movement patterns were unpredictable. Their patience exceeded anything other Western forces had demonstrated. The documents used a specific term for Australian soldiers that was applied to no other Allied force: Ma Rung. The Vietnamese words carried connotations that went beyond ordinary military respect. Ma means ghost or phantom. Rung means jungle or forest. Together, the terms suggested something supernatural, something that existed outside the normal categories of human warfare. The Viet Cong were not merely cautious about the Australian SAS. They were afraid in a way they had never been afraid of any other enemy. This fear had measurable consequences that the Australian task force documented through captured documents, interrogation reports, and observable changes in enemy behavior. Viet Cong activity in areas where SAS patrols were known to operate dropped dramatically compared to adjacent sectors controlled by American forces. Units that would aggressively engage American patrols refused to enter territory where the SAS might be present. Movement along supply routes through SAS patrol areas declined. Recruitment in villages near active SAS zones became more difficult, as word spread among the population that something in the jungle was killing Viet Cong fighters in ways that left no explanation. The contrast with how the Viet Cong treated American forces could not have been sharper. In August 1966, just 2 months after the Australians established Nui Dat, the Viet Cong 275th Regiment, supported by D445 Battalion, massed an estimated 2,500 fighters and launched what appeared to be a deliberate attack toward the Australian base. What followed was the Battle of Long Tan, fought in a rubber plantation east of Nui Dat during a torrential monsoon downpour. D Company of the 6th Royal Australian Regiment, just 108 men, found itself engaged by this massive force and fought for hours in conditions of near-zero visibility, sustained by desperate artillery support and ammunition resupplied by helicopter. 18 Australians were killed, but the Viet Cong left at least 245 dead on the battlefield. Long Tan taught the Viet Cong that even conventional Australian infantry fought differently than what they expected. The Australians did not break. They did not panic. Their artillery was devastatingly accurate. Their discipline under fire was absolute. The Viet Cong had expected the kind of disintegration they had seen in South Vietnamese units, and occasionally in American forces caught by surprise. What they got instead was a killing field created by a company that held its ground against odds of more than 20-1. After Long Tan, the Viet Cong never again attempted a regimental-sized engagement against the Australian task force. The lesson had been absorbed. Direct confrontation with Australians was expensive beyond what any tactical objective could justify, and if the conventional infantry could inflict that kind of punishment, what the SAS was doing in the jungle beyond the wire was something far worse. The operational logs of D445 Battalion tell the story in the language of men who were losing a war they did not understand. Entries from late 1968 and 1969 record the progressive degradation of unit effectiveness in the face of an enemy that seemed to operate by different rules than any the battalion had encountered in its years of fighting. 3 comrades sent to collect water who never returned and left no trace. A sentry found dead at his post without adjacent positions hearing any sound. Movement restricted to daylight hours because the darkness had become too dangerous. Requests for reinforcement denied because higher headquarters considered the area secure from American operations, not understanding that the threat came from a force that higher headquarters had never adequately assessed. The psychological impact compounded over time. Viet Cong fighters in Phuoc Tuy began exhibiting behaviors that their political officers recognized as symptoms of deteriorating morale, but could not effectively address. Soldiers refused night patrol assignments. Units moved through jungle in tight clusters rather than tactically dispersed formations, seeking psychological comfort from proximity to comrades at the cost of tactical vulnerability. Some fighters began performing spiritual rituals before entering areas where the Ma Rung were reported to operate, invoking protection from entities that their Marxist political education was supposed to have rendered irrelevant. The fear was not irrational. It was the entirely logical response of experienced soldiers to a threat they could neither predict, detect, nor counter. The Viet Cong were among the most capable guerrilla fighters in history. They had driven out the French. They were fighting the most powerful military on Earth to a standstill. They understood jungle warfare at a level that few conventional forces could approach, and they had concluded, through years of bitter experience, that the Australian SAS had surpassed them at their own discipline. This is the part of the story that demands explanation. How did soldiers from a country on the other side of the world, a country of open grasslands and arid deserts and suburban cricket pitches, develop jungle warfare capabilities that exceeded those of men who had been born and raised in the Vietnamese jungle? The answer reaches back decades before the first Australian soldier set foot in Vietnam, and draws on traditions far older than any modern military doctrine. The Australian SAS was formed in 1957, modeled on the British Special Air Service, with which it shared the motto, "Who dares wins." But the unit's character was shaped less by its British parentage than by the particular demands of Australian military history. Australia had spent the better part of a century fighting what military historians call small wars, conflicts in remote and demanding terrain against enemies who could not be overwhelmed with conventional firepower because there was no conventional firepower to overwhelm them with. The Boer War at the turn of the 20th century had given Australian soldiers their first experience of fighting a mobile, dispersed enemy in difficult country. The campaigns against the Japanese in New Guinea during the Second World War had taught brutal lessons about jungle combat, about what happened to soldiers who underestimated the environment and the enemy that inhabited it. Kokoda, Milne Bay, Buna, Gona. The names were burned into Australian military memory as reminders that technological superiority meant nothing when the jungle consumed your logistics, your visibility, and your assumptions. The Malayan emergency from 1948 to 1960 had provided 12 years of sustained operational experience in exactly the kind of counterinsurgency warfare that Vietnam would demand. Malaya was the crucible. Australian forces deployed to the jungles of the Malay Peninsula learned to hunt communist terrorists through terrain so dense that visibility rarely exceeded a few meters. They developed the small unit patrol techniques that would become the foundation of SAS doctrine. They learned to move slowly, to listen, to read the jungle as a source of intelligence rather than an obstacle to movement. They learned that patience was not the absence of action, but the precondition for effective action. They learned that a 5-man patrol moving silently through the jungle could accomplish what a battalion crashing through the undergrowth could not. The U.S. Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, freely admitted at an ANZUS meeting in Canberra in 1962 that the American armed forces knew little about jungle warfare. Given the experience that Australian forces had gained in Malaya, it was understood that Australia's most valuable contribution to Vietnam would be precisely this expertise. The first Australian military advisors sent to Vietnam in 1962, the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, were hand-picked veterans of the Malayan campaign, men whose average age was 35 and whose experience in counterinsurgency was unmatched by any comparable American unit. When the SAS deployed to Borneo in 1965 during the Indonesian confrontation, they refined these skills further, operating along the border between Malaysian territory and Indonesian Kalimantan SAS patrols conducted reconnaissance missions that lasted weeks, living in the jungle, eating what the jungle provided, becoming so thoroughly adapted to the environment that they were effectively invisible to Indonesian forces operating in the same area. The regiment's one squadron mounted over 60 patrols in its first deployment, learning the brutal discipline of extended operations in primary jungle where everything, the terrain, the climate, the wildlife seemed designed to break men who were not prepared to meet it on its own terms. Some patrols in Borneo lasted as long as 89 days. The men who survived these deployments emerged with a level of jungle expertise that no training program could replicate, because the expertise was not merely technical. It was existential. They had learned to exist in the jungle as part of it, not as visitors to it. This was the force that arrived in Vietnam in 1966, and the Viet Cong, who had spent 2 decades developing their own mastery of jungle warfare, immediately recognized that they were facing something unprecedented. The recognition did not come all at once. It built through accumulated evidence, through failed ambushes and unexplained losses, and tracking teams that returned empty-handed. It built through the testimony of survivors who described engagements that seemed impossible, ambushes sprung from positions that should have been detectable, withdrawals executed in total, silence through vegetation that should have made silence impossible. By 1968, the Viet Cong had developed completely different tactical guidance for engaging Australian versus American forces. The contrast in these documents is stark and speaks volumes about what the enemy had learned through years of observation. For Americans, the guidance emphasized exploitation of known weaknesses, target their helicopter landing zones, ambush their predictable patrol routes, use their reliance on artillery against them by withdrawing before it arrives, strike hard in the first 30 seconds, and disappear. For Australians, the guidance was a single word expanded into a doctrine: avoidance. The recommendation was not to engage Australian SAS patrols under any circumstances unless contact was unavoidable, and if contact occurred, to break it off immediately and withdraw to areas where the Australians were not operating. The documents explicitly stated that attempting to ambush Australian SAS patrols was more likely to result in the destruction of the ambush force than the destruction of the patrol, because the Australians were more likely to detect the ambush before entering the killing zone than to walk into it unknowingly. This was an extraordinary admission from a force that had built its entire operational doctrine around the ambush. The Viet Cong were, in effect, acknowledging that the Australians had reversed the fundamental dynamic of the war. In every other sector of Vietnam, the Viet Cong were the hunters, and Western forces were the prey. In Puoc Tuy, the relationship had been inverted. The Australians had become the apex predators, and the Viet Cong had become the hunted. The statistics bore this out with brutal clarity. Over 6 years of operations in Vietnam, the Australian and New Zealand SAS conducted nearly 1,200 patrols. They killed 492 enemy fighters with another 106 probable kills. They wounded 47 more and captured 11 prisoners. Their own losses across the entire war totaled 1 killed in action, 1 died of wounds, 3 accidentally killed, 1 missing, and 1 death from illness. 28 men were wounded. That was the cost of nearly 1,200 patrols in enemy-controlled territory over 6 years. It was a ratio of lethality and survivability that no other unit in the war on either side could approach. The SAS achieved the highest kill ratio of any Australian unit in Vietnam, and by some measures, the highest of any Allied unit in the entire conflict. These numbers did not happen by accident or luck or favorable terrain. They were the product of a doctrine that prioritized intelligence over firepower, patience over aggression, and adaptation over technological superiority. And the Viet Cong understood this, perhaps better than anyone on the Allied side, because they were the ones paying the price for it. The broader Australian Task Force operations reinforced what the SAS had established. The conventional infantry battalions, the 1st through 9th battalions of the Royal Australian Regiment that rotated through Phuoc Tuy, adopted patrol-intensive tactics that kept constant pressure on Viet Cong movements. Australian patrols dominated the terrain between Nui Dat and the Viet Cong base areas, making it progressively more difficult for the enemy to move, resupply, or maintain contact with the civilian population. The strategy was not attrition in the American sense, not the accumulation of body counts as a measure of progress. It was systematic disruption of the Viet Cong's ability to function as a military and political organization. The Americans measured success in enemy dead. The Australians measured success in enemy capability degraded. The distinction was fundamental, and its consequences were profound. Australian patrols targeted enemy supply lines, base camps, and food caches with relentless persistence. Hundreds of ambushes were set on the outskirts of villages, catching enemy supply parties attempting to collect food from sympathetic civilians. The D445 Battalion, which had once moved freely through the province's villages to collect rice and other provisions, found that every resupply mission now risked walking into a devastating Australian ambush. Over the course of the war, Australian forces captured more than 1,800 enemy bunker systems and base camps. The average amount of food seized per base camp declined from over 1,200 kilograms in 1966 to fewer than 50 kilograms by 1970. The Viet Cong's logistical infrastructure in Phuoc Tuy was being systematically dismantled, not through bombing campaigns or large-scale sweeps, but through the accumulated effect of thousands of small patrols, each one denying the enemy a piece of the operational landscape they needed to survive. The effect on D445 Battalion was devastating. This unit, which had once controlled the province and launched regimental-sized operations against South Vietnamese forces, was progressively reduced to the point where it could barely feed itself. By 1970 and 1971, D445 was being forced to leave the province entirely to forage for food, returning only to conduct sporadic operations before being driven out again by Australian patrols. The unit was never destroyed, but it was neutralized, not through a single dramatic battle, but through the slow, patient strangulation of its ability to operate. The Viet Cong understood what was happening to them, and their documents reflect a grudging professional respect that makes the captured assessments among the most fascinating primary sources of the war. The language used to describe Australian operations is precise, analytical, and devoid of the propagandistic tone that characterizes most Viet Cong documentation about enemy forces. The Americans are described in terms of their vulnerabilities. The Australians are described in terms of their capabilities. The difference in tone is unmistakable and deeply telling. There is a particular passage in one captured assessment that encapsulates the Viet Cong's understanding of what made the Australians different. It describes the Australian approach not as a set of tactics, but as a way of being in the jungle. The Australians, the document observes, did not move through the jungle as foreigners. They inhabited it. They became part of its rhythms and its silences. They disappeared into it in a way that no other Western force had achieved, or, in the Viet Cong's assessment, was likely to achieve. This observation cut to the heart of what made the Australian approach so difficult to counter. The techniques themselves, the slow movement, the noise discipline, the counter-tracking, were not secrets. Any military force with sufficient training time could theoretically adopt them. But the psychology underlying the techniques, the willingness to suppress every instinct toward action, speed, and aggression in favor of patience, stillness, and adaptation, was not something that could be taught in a training course. It had to be cultivated through a military culture that valued these qualities, and it had to be sustained by soldiers who had internalized them at a level deeper than conscious technique. American Special Operations Forces recognized the effectiveness of Australian methods and attempted to replicate them. Australian SAS personnel provided instructors to the MACV Recondo School, where American long-range reconnaissance patrol teams received advanced training. Individual American operators who worked alongside Australians absorbed elements of SAS methodology and carried them back to their own units. But institutional adoption proved difficult because the methods required not just different training, but different assumptions about what constituted effective military operations. The American military of the 1960s was built on the premise that superior firepower produced superior results: more bullets, more bombs, more helicopters, more troops. If a tactic was not working, the institutional response was to apply more force. The Australian approach inverted this logic entirely. Less force applied with greater precision, fewer men operating with greater skill, less technology compensated by greater adaptation. The philosophical gap between these approaches was too wide for institutional adoption to bridge, at least within the time frame of the Vietnam War. It would take decades for the American military to fully absorb the lessons that the Australians had demonstrated. When the United States undertook its major reform of special operations capabilities in the 1980s, the principles that emerged bore striking resemblance to what the Australian SAS had practiced in Vietnam 20 years earlier. Emphasis on small unit tactics and individual operator judgment, prioritization of stealth and patience over firepower and aggression, recognition that cultural adaptation and environmental integration could achieve what technology alone could not. But the E&I cost of learning slowly was measured in lives. Every year that American institutions resisted the evidence accumulating from Phuoc Toi Province, soldiers continued dying in ambushes that better doctrine might have prevented, in patrols that better methodology might have kept invisible, in engagements that better tactics might have avoided entirely. The Viet Cong knew the score. They had studied both approaches with the analytical rigor of professionals whose survival depended on accurate assessment. They had concluded, documented, and disseminated throughout their command structure the judgment that Australian methods were fundamentally more dangerous than American methods. They had instructed their fighters to avoid the Australians and engage the Americans. They had admitted in their own operational documents that the Ma Rung had beaten them at the game they had spent 20 years perfecting. That political officer standing in the cave in the Mae Tao Mountains in November 1968 would ultimately prevail. But in that moment, in that cave, he was acknowledging something that military professionals on both sides of the war understood, but that institutions struggled to accept. The Australians had solved the problem. They had solved it with 150 men. They had solved it without airstrikes, without battalion-sized sweeps, without the massive logistical apparatus that American forces required to sustain operations. They had solved it with patience, with silence, with adaptation, and with a willingness to become something other than conventional soldiers. The Viet Cong commander who told his men, "We've been watching you," was not issuing a threat. He was delivering a confession. "We've been watching you, and we cannot understand what you are. We've been watching you, and we cannot find a way to fight you. We've been watching you, and the only conclusion we can reach is that you are better at this than we are." Ma Rung, the phantoms of the jungle, the soldiers who turned the hunters into the hunted, the force so small it barely registered on organizational charts, yet so effective that the enemy's own documents ordered avoidance as the only viable tactical response. Nearly 1,200 patrols, 492 confirmed enemy dead, one SAS trooper killed in action across 6 years of continuous operations. Those are not statistics. Those are the mathematics of what happens when soldiers stop trying to overpower the jungle and start becoming part of it. When they stop moving like visitors and start moving like shadows. When they stop thinking like soldiers and start thinking like hunters. The Viet Cong watched, they studied, they analyzed, and in the end, they wrote down the only honest conclusion available to them. Avoid the Australians. Some lessons once taught cannot be unlearned. The fighters who received that briefing in the cave in 1968 carried that knowledge with them for the rest of the war. The commanders who wrote those assessments never rescinded them. The institutional memory of the Viet Cong in Phuoc Tuy province, passed from veteran to replacement, from political officer to new recruit, from one generation of fighters to the next, contained a single consistent warning about the force based at Nui Date. Do not hunt the phantoms. The phantoms hunt you. 580 men served in the Australian SAS in Vietnam across those 6 years. 580 men, rotating through in squadron-sized deployments, never more than about 150 at any one time. They arrived from a country that most of the world associated with beaches and sheep stations, and a relaxed way of life that seemed incompatible with the grim necessities of jungle warfare. They returned to a country that, like America, was tearing itself apart over the morality of the war. Many of them never spoke about what they had done. Some carried wounds, visible and invisible, that would shadow them for decades. The psychological cost of becoming what the jungle demanded was real and lasting, and no statistical account of kills and casualties could capture the full price that was paid. But what they left behind in the jungles of Phuoc Tuy province endures in ways that their modest veterans' reunions and quiet retirements might not suggest. They left behind a body of operational evidence so compelling that it eventually reshaped how the most powerful military on earth trains its special operations forces. They left behind a legacy that special forces around the world still study, still teach, still attempt to replicate. They left behind a name whispered in cave complexes and jungle base camps throughout a province that the most powerful military on earth could not pacify, spoken by fighters who had beaten the French Empire and were in the process of defeating the American one. Ma Rung, the phantoms of the jungle. The Viet Cong watched them for 6 years. They studied every pattern, analyzed every engagement, documented every tactic they could identify. They brought every resource of their formidable intelligence apparatus to bear on the problem of understanding what the Australians were doing and how to counter it. And at the end of all that watching, all that studying, all that analysis, they reached the only honest conclusion available to professionals who respected the evidence of their own experience. We cannot beat them, avoid them. Let the phantoms have the jungle. Some might say the Australians lost the war, along with everyone else on the Allied side. Saigon fell in 1975. The dominoes that Cold War strategists feared did not fall precisely as predicted, but Vietnam was reunified under communist rule, and the men who had fought in Phuoc Tuy province had fought for a cause that did not, in the end, prevail. That is one way to read the history, but there is another way, and it is the way that military professionals on both sides read it. In the 6 years they operated in Phuoc Tuy, the Australians demonstrated that counterinsurgency warfare could be conducted effectively, that a guerrilla enemy could be beaten at his own game, that the jungle did not have to belong to the insurgent. They proved that doctrine built on patience, intelligence, and adaptation could achieve results that all the firepower in the world could not. They proved that 150 men operating with the right skills and the right philosophy could dominate a province that 20,000 could not. The enemy confirmed this with the most reliable evidence available, their own behavior. They stopped fighting the Australians, not because they were defeated, not because they were weak, but because the Australians had made fighting them too costly, too unpredictable, and too terrifying to sustain. "We've been watching you," the commander told his men, "in that cave beneath the Ma Rung mountains, and what we have seen is something we cannot overcome. That is the testimony of the enemy, and in war, no testimony carries more weight